When you were growing up, what did you learn about sex and how did you learn about it? Christian parents, with assistance from youth leaders in the church, are given the responsibility to bring up their children in the nurture and instruction of the Lord. This includes talking about God's order and design for sexuality. And because we live in a hyper-sexualized world that's providing its own narrative on gender and sexuality, taking on this responsibility to instruct our kids about God's design is non-negotiable. It's especially important that we correct the erroneous narrative the culture is throwing at our daughters. What should we be teaching them about sex and sexuality? How can we communicate the biblical narrative on this good gift from God? Stick with us as we chat with Tim Geiger about a letter on sex and sexuality that he's written to his teenage daughter on this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Well, it's another episode of Youth Culture Matters. I'm Walt Mueller here in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania at the Universal Headquarters of CPYU, the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. Back in our studio with Chris Wagner.
Good morning.
Yep, and no Jason again.
No, he's bailed on us. How many times in a row now?
He's on vacation, which I'm starting to wonder how much vacation he actually gets. Yeah. And I think, one of these times we ought to just call him. And, when he's not with us. So let's just keep
preferably when it's like 4 in the morning,
right.
West Coast time.
Right. Maybe we'll wait till 10 o'clock our time, and that way it'll be 7 a.m. We'll see what kind of slacker he really is. But he's out with his family. I actually don't know where they are or what they're doing. I know he likes to camp. He likes to hike. He likes to torture his young children with those things. But we'll find out where he is. So today, Chris, we're going to talk to someone who's written a letter to his daughter, which I've done. Have you done? You have a daughter. Have you done that?
I have not written a letter to her like that, no.
Okay.
Not in this fashion.
Yeah. So you have 3 children, boy, girl, boy.
Correct.
How old's Joey, your daughter?
My daughter is
Josephine.
7. Yep.
Yeah, so she's 7. Man, 7 years old. I have 4 children, girl, boy. And our oldest daughter is now, I think she turns 35 this year. So I am, what does that make me? Go ahead, say
Grandpa?
It. Old. It makes me old. But do you remember like when you first had a daughter? Because I grew up in a family of all boys. Now, you had sisters.
I had 2 younger sisters.
Yeah,
yep.
2 sisters. I grew up with a family of all boys, so I knew very, very little. I know a little bit more, but it's still very little about females, having grown up just with brothers. But do you remember when your daughter was born, what you thought? I mean, were there any thoughts that went through your head because she was born female?
Yeah, sure. The one that comes to mind is, wow, this little girl's going to be, she's going to have me wrapped around her finger. Like, she instantly, Daddy was going to do anything for this little girl.
Okay, so you went down that road.
Yep, I did.
Yeah,
and I saw that played out. Like, I saw how my dad treated my sisters, and he did anything he possibly could for them, and so that was modeled in many ways. So that was one of the things. And it's a different. Obviously, it's not as though I won't do anything for my sons, right? But there is some kind of difference. I don't know if I could articulate it, but it's that kind of the way I articulate it is being wrapped around her little finger, and it's just that little girl calling you daddy. There's something about that just pulls at your heartstrings, I guess. But
yeah, it is neat, and and I have so many great memories of that with Caitlin and Bethany. And the truth of the matter is, I'm not going to diminish the teenage years. You love your kids like crazy, but some of the dynamic does change. So fasten your seatbelt.
Sure, and
I mean,
I think there's with girls too. There's that wrapped around your finger doing anything for. There's a protective nature.
Yeah.
That instinctively kicks in. That's different than boys than what you have for your sons. And not that you won't protect your sons, but there's a certain protective instinct I think that kicks in that's a little different.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Lisa jokes oftentimes asking you about when Joey was born. Lisa often, will talk about what I said that just seems so ridiculous now when Caitlin was born, our first one, up at Beverly Hospital in Massachusetts, the North Shore of Massachusetts. So she's born, and we had gotten to know the doctor fairly well. He'd actually become somewhat of a friend, so...
By the way, that's the second podcast in a row you've used that Boston North Shore accent. I've got to put an end to that.
That's because you're a Yankees fan?
Well, we just took 2 out of 3 this past weekend.
Okay,
so.
all right. Okay. So it all centers on that, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, so Caitlin's born, and I mean, just the emotion. Of course, for us, it was our first child, so just the emotion of that. And I looked at her, and of course, you're counting fingers and toes. I don't know. That was just kind of instinctual. You're counting 2 arms, 2 legs, 5 fingers on each hand, 5 toes on each hand. And then, I'm looking to see, what do we have, a boy or a girl? And it's a little girl. And so the doctor allowed me to announce that in my excitement, and my exact words, I still remember them to this day. I remember saying them, as does Lisa remember hearing them. I said, Lisa, it's a little girl, and she's beautiful. She looks just like me. You never heard that before?
That sounds... I probably have. Doesn't make it any less funny, especially seeing that I'm sitting across from you, and I can see how beautiful you are.
Yeah, right. Well, you know why I said it? I mean, I do remember why I said it. Lisa was like, oh, no. But I do remember why I said it, because she was bawling her eyes out. And the scrunched look on her face reminded me of there's actually a movie clip of me sitting in a bed bawling my eyes out when I was little, which, and of course now saying this is the first time I've thought this, why in the world did my dad take that? I think I know why I was crying, because he came in and woke me up, and he had one of those, 8mm movie cameras with about 20 headlights, fog lights across the bar, and so he was just blinding me. But I was crying, and I just thought, man, her face looks like mine. But yeah, and then the growing up years, and just wanting as a Christian parent to see your children, your daughter, grow up to follow Jesus, to make good decisions. And so many times, our concern about our kids making good decisions. I just had this conversation on Sunday with a couple of friends who were, kind of airing out some frustrations with their teenage kids. They were at our church, and the thing that I said was, one of the reasons why we get so worked up about all this is because we remember what we were like and what we did.
Oh, sure.
And what our parents still don't know. And so we had that conversation. But you want to help your kids avoid that, and your girls especially, because especially in today's world, just the roles that culture is telling them to assume are just so destructive and so ungodly in so many ways. So yeah, we as dads and as youth workers, we really need to be diligent, moms too, about talking to our girls about what it means to grow up to be a follower of Jesus in this world. And we've got to do it with our sons as well. But there's some different ways to do this. And today what we're going to do is talk to Tim Geiger. I've known Tim for a few years. He is actually now heading up an organization called Harvest USA. We refer to them often here on the podcast. We've had other folks from Harvest USA on the podcast in the past, and they are really helping the church, and they are helping the families point kids, point adults, point ourselves in a direction of healthy biblical sexuality. And I think they're rewriting the script in some ways, the bad script that some of us heard from the church when we were growing up, that whether it was said explicitly or implicitly, we don't talk about sex, and we come to the belief erroneously that God doesn't care about sex, or God thinks sex is a dirty thing. But Tim's a proponent of talking about it, basically because of his own story. You'll hear a little bit of that. But now that he has a daughter, he has written and blogged on sex and sexuality and gender in today's world for girls, and in the form of a letter to his daughter. So we're going to take a break here, but when we come back, we're going to jump into a conversation with Tim Geiger. Stick with us. In an effort to help you help the kids you know and love navigate their emerging sexuality to the glory of God, we've launched a sexual integrity initiative here at CPYU. Thanks to a generous grant from a company called DAS, you can access our sexual integrity initiative and a growing number of resources for free by visiting the website at sexualintegrityinitiative.com. Well, welcome back, everybody, to this episode of Youth Culture Matters. And today we're going to have a conversation with our friend Tim Geiger. Tim is involved with a ministry that I've come to admire, rely on, send people to. The ministry is called Harvest USA. We'll ask Tim to talk a little bit about that, but dealing with a lot of the issues that we're dealing with on a cultural level now, but coming at them from a biblical perspective. And I love Harvest USA because it offers me, it offers youth workers, it offers parents insight into and the ability to communicate the biblical narrative on God's good gift of sexuality. And they're working hard to not only communicate the biblical narrative, but do so in a way that's compelling in response to the cultural narrative on sexuality. So, Tim, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, before we get into what I really want to talk about here, which is a letter you wrote to your daughter, and I love these things because I did this years ago with my oldest daughter and have done it with all my kids, 2 boys, 2 girls, over the years. But before we do that, just a little bit about your personal story, your involvement there at Harvest then, and what Harvest actually is, because I probably didn't do the best job of communicating who you are.
You did a great job, Walt. But Harvest USA is a ministry that is very shortly going to celebrate its 35th anniversary. We've been around since 1983, and we have a twofold focus. The first part of our mission is to work primarily with Christians. So individual Christians, families, spouses, who have been impacted in different ways by sexual sin and sexual struggle. And we don't call the ministry that we do counseling, because counseling is focused on fixing a problem. It's focused on getting over one particular hurdle in life. We call what we do discipleship, because the entire aim of our ministry is to help these men and women, these boys and girls, understand what it means that Jesus is Lord and Savior and Redeemer in the midst of the hard things that they're going through. We want to help them see the Lord as not only their King, but as someone who is able to come alongside of them and help them and be their covering and their shepherd. As they learn how to live in obedience to his word. So that's one part of what we do. The other part is we equip the church to do that very same kind of ministry within the church, because we believe this ministry actually belongs to the church. My own story is that I came to Harvest 21 years ago, and that every time I tell this story, the interval keeps getting longer, and I'm just amazed that I've stayed as young as I am. But that was a joke. But we need a laugh track.
Yeah.
But
trust me, I have to travel with one of those.
But I came to Harvest back in 1997 struggling with same-sex attraction. And I had been a Christian much of my life. I had been struggling with same-sex attraction for much of my life, and was quite literally at the end of my rope. I was despairing because I had tried everything I knew how to try. I had prayed multiple times a day for years. I had tried to tough it out on my own and was finding no success in living differently. And the Lord began a wonderful work in my life when I went to Harvest USA. I know I was a Christian before, but I really began to mature as a Christian as I began to receive the gift of discipleship through the ministry of Harvest USA. I was in ministry for a couple of years, became a volunteer, and then came on staff in 2003, and have held various positions in the organization. Now I'm the president.
Mm. So you didn't, I mean, this is your story. You didn't open the newspaper one morning when you were looking for a job and say, oh, Harvest USA, they're hiring. I mean, this really is what you grew into, you were nurtured into.
It's what I was nurtured into. And Walt, in all honesty, I did not want to work for Harvest USA. I went to seminary to be a pastor. And, as a Presbyterian, you're not allowed to say these things, but when I was praying about where the Lord was calling me to labor, the Lord made it very clear while I was still in seminary that he was calling me to minister to others as I had been ministered to. And here I am.
Can I ask you, I want to ask you about the discipleship process that you experienced with Harvest. And, you said, I was a Christian before, but through that discipleship process, what I heard you say was that things became more real, you grew in your faith, there was a depth that was maybe lacking before, an understanding. I think this is an important question because youth workers and parents are wondering, how do we nurture and disciple our kids? What was it about that process with Harvest that, in your memory, you think back on? Were there one or two things that really stick out to you that made that significant, the approach that Harvest took?
I think there were two things, Walt. The first was I had been struggling with same-sex attraction for about 20 years. And for me, same-sex attraction was always the desire that I had to overcome. It was always the thing that kept me from being the righteous man that I wanted to be. And encountering the Lord in particular through the ministry of Harvest USA, I began to realize that same-sex attraction wasn't the problem. The problem was actually far more deeply seated than that. James talks about it in James chapter 1, where he says that we can't blame God when we're tempted, because it says that each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. That's James 14 and 15. And what James is talking about is the fact that there are these strong desires inside of us, not sexual desire, but desires for things like affirmation and affection and comfort and control. And sex becomes, and relationship becomes, one means in order to satisfy those desires. God says, it's only in me that you have the right satisfaction, the right resolution for those desires. But I was looking everywhere else. I was looking in sex. I was looking in food. I was looking pretty much in every other created thing that I could find in order to try to feel satisfied in those areas. And at Harvest, I began to realize that I was like that donkey in Jeremiah that's just running from place to place, sniffing the wind, trying to find where my satisfaction is going to come from. I began to be drawn back to my first love and to begin to know him for the first time. The other thing that was really impactful about the ministry of Harvest USA is that Harvest has never taught that it's up to you to do business with God one-on-one. Harvest USA has a very, very high view of the church. And one of the things that we teach and try to impress on the church is that no one can walk in repentance on their own. We need one another. Hebrews 3 verses 12 and 13 says, unless we have other brothers or sisters who are exhorting us to the truth daily, we'll develop evil, unbelieving hearts that lead us to fall away from the living God. So we need men need men around them, women need women around them to help them stay focused on the journey and to stay focused on the goal of being in relationship with Jesus. And that's something I experienced here at Harvest. I never had authentic friends until I encountered Harvest 21 years ago. And that's the kind of relationship that we try to encourage churches to develop among their members, so that there is this organic network of disciplers at work in a person's life.
So take the issue of idolatry head on, understand where that comes from, and then do so in the context of loving, grace-filled, supportive community. And when I say supportive and loving, I mean these are people too who are not afraid to, because they love you, tell you the truth. And that's so helpful, so helpful. Well, that's good. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to ask you about a blog post you put up recently. It was titled "On Being a Woman: A Father's Words to His Daughter." And this really caught my attention because I have 2 girls, I have 2 boys. I've written letters over the years to all of them, and I remember one of the first and one of the first most, I would say most, for me, well thought out letters I had ever written was to my older daughter. We can put that up on the website too, Chris, because we have that. Or on the with the podcast, we have that on our website. But I thought through some of these issues, and one of the things that I talked about was, sexuality. I talked about other issues, contrasting what the cultural narrative, what that's teaching her and where it's trying to steer her, as opposed to the biblical narrative. And I really believe this is at the heart of what it means to be a dad, a Christian dad, to lead your children, what it means to tell the truth to your children, what it means to be a Christian parent. Moms and dads need to have these conversations, and writing sometimes is a great way to do it. And so you write this, and I love what you say at the beginning: to fathers everywhere, I make this earnest appeal. Teach your daughters that it is safe and good to live as a godly woman in a world that would teach them otherwise. What about, let me start with a cultural narrative. What is it about the cultural narrative that, obviously our motivation here should be to bring honor and glory to God and tell the truth. But the cultural narrative steps in and creates, I think, a deeper sense of urgency to do this. What is it about the cultural narrative that you really wanted to push back on? Call out the cultural narrative here, if you would.
Sure. If the podcast were, 3 days long, we probably couldn't touch on every aspect of the cultural narrative that is in opposition to truth. But I think that there are 2 main things that I was pushing back on. The first aspect of the cultural narrative is that there's no glory in gender. There is no glory in being a man or being a woman created in God's image, and we see that in today's culture. We see a move toward androgyny. We see a move toward people saying that men and women are equal, and they're not unique. They're really kind of what's the word I'm looking for? You can substitute one for the other.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I'm pushing back on. The other thing is that the culture says that your body is your own, and it's nothing but a mass of chemicals and neurons, and every impulse that you feel is just a biological impulse designed to bring you happiness. And so the greatest goal of being a human being is to find the most pleasure possible, and that flies in the face of what God tells us in His Word. He says that we're made in His image. He says that we were created for a purpose, and that is to glorify Him. He says that we have work to do, and that work is building up the body of Christ and stewarding His creation. And that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of a meta narrative, not only in the blog post you're mentioning, but in the larger work of Harvest USA.
So when you encounter, and I think we've all done this, but particularly in your ministry there at Harvest USA, when you folks encounter people who have grown up believing the cultural narrative, following the cultural narrative. Talk about that. When they walk through the doors, when they make a phone call, what do you hear? What is the fruit of the cultural narrative?
The fruit of the cultural narrative is that this person believes that he or she can only depend on himself, that it's up, like I believed 21 years ago when I first came to Harvest USA, that it was up to me to work out my own righteousness, that it was up to me to find happiness and satisfaction. And the Bible says, again, that is a complete lie. The Bible says that I'm a part of a body of which Christ is the head. The Bible says that I was saved into the community of the church, brothers and sisters who are there to glorify God, but also to build me up and to help me become a fully functioning member of the body. And so the average person who calls Harvest USA, within 5 minutes, we generally hear the same story from everyone, and that is living life as an individual just hasn't worked for me.
And there's desperation many times.
Yeah, because people only call us or write to us when they're at the end of the rope.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the messages that you communicate to your daughter here, who, by the way, let me see here, she's 14?
She's 14.
Yeah. When
she thinks she's 30.
Yeah.
But she's 14.
Yeah. That'll all even out at some point. When she's 30, she's going to wish she was 14, right?
I know.
Let me ask you a question about this, too, because this is a question I hear all the time. At what age should we start talking about sex, sexuality, and gender to our kids?
As soon as your child begins to interact with their environment. So, we began talking with our daughter when she was about 3.
Yeah.
And obviously, you talk about sex, sexuality, and gender in age-specific ways. But you don't wait until your child is going through adolescence in order to give them the mechanics of sex talk and leave it at that. I firmly believe, and Harvest USA even has a resource, actually several resources that talk about this, but if you wanted to link this to the podcast, I would be happy to include the PDF of an article that we write that talks about how to begin having those conversations with your child at a very, very early age, and to continue to progress in the depth and breadth of those conversations as your child matures.
Yeah. I it's not funny, but I do sometimes chuckle. I chuckle in disbelief. It's just a response mechanism that helps me. But when I am traveling and someone will ask me this question, and I'll preface it by saying, my son is 15 years old. We haven't had discussions about sex and sexuality with him yet. We're not sure when to do that because we're not really sure if he's thinking about those things. And, my answer to that is, well, I can guarantee you he's thinking about those things.
Sure.
It's just, and this is, and like we were talking about the cultural narrative before, you say as soon as they're interacting with the environment
Sure.
is just permeated by the cultural narrative. The cultural narrative is catechizing them.
It is.
Really, from the time they emerge from the womb. I mean, from the time they start to take their first breaths.
Yeah.
And
so here's the way it works, Walt. We're not talking about just disseminating information to your child. We're talking about helping them build a biblical worldview. And the biblical worldview isn't limited to sex, sexuality, and gender. This is a biblical worldview that will help your child really understand that God is sovereign and that he's sovereign in love and that they can trust him. Like even very young children, 2- and 3-year-olds, are interacting with family members. They're interacting with whatever media you expose them to. They're interacting with their friends. They're beginning to develop their own worldviews. And shame on us parents if we don't step in and help that child brick by brick construct a worldview that will give them a solid foundation. When they do get to the age where they are able to misuse sex and sexuality and gender, so that they'll be less likely to do that.
Hmm.
My desire in encouraging fathers and mothers to build up their children in this way is that the ordinary temptations that their teens face would not become life-dominating sin struggles.
Well, I like the way that you say that. Say that again. The ordinary
Yeah.
temptations that they face would not become life-dominating.
Life-dominating sin struggles.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
just if you look at the statistics about the number of young people today who self-identify as LGBTQ, this isn't even talking about heterosexual promiscuity, which, I haven't even seen any reliable data on that over the last 10 years, because I don't think it's just assumed that if you're a teenager, you're going to be sexually active. But just the number of people in Generation Z who are self-identifying as LGBTQ is more than twice Generation Y on back.
Yeah. Well, there are far too many headings that you have in this. I mean, you basically what you did in this was you went through a series of statements about who you are, what you should believe. There's far too many to talk about here right now. People
Sure.
need to read this. It's not a lengthy article. It's not a lengthy letter. It's something you can sit down and read rather quickly, and I would say read it carefully, then read it again. But I want to highlight a couple. One is you make the statement, your core identity is not as a sexual being.
Mm.
Lay that out for us, because you use the term self-identify. Look, when I was a teenager, we did not use, I don't even think we used the term identity. We didn't talk about how we identified. I often say identity was something, if we used that word, it was in relationship to some spy movie we had seen where someone was wearing a disguise trying to shield their identity, change their identity. Now we have sexualized this. We talk about gender. It just seems even at the youngest age, we're talking about self-identifying, or my identity is as. And it's not just with sexuality. It's with a variety of things. So work that out, because I think that's a core issue here for the Christian.
Sure. So sexual desire is problematic for a number of reasons in a fallen world. But one of the reasons why it is so problematic is because it's one of the strongest desires that a human being can experience. Anyone who's experienced strong sexual desire, anyone who's experienced lust for someone else, knows that it's something that literally overrides every other thought process and impulse that you have. And God designed sexual desire to be so powerful because in its proper context, it is supposed to be an amazing experience between a husband and a wife that does many things. But one of the things that it does is the two becoming one in that perfect or imperfect intimacy, that human intimacy, reflects the perfect intimacy that we have with Christ. And the misuse of sexual activity and sexual desire is so dangerous because we were designed by God to literally be bound, physiologically and psychologically bound to our spouses. He created our brains to create and absorb neurotransmitters and hormones that literally psychologically bind us to the person we're having sex with. So if you misuse sex, if you misuse sexual desire, you wind up experiencing one of two realities. One is you find it impossible to be bound to another individual because you've conditioned yourself to just pursue your own pleasure and to be bound to seeking after your own satisfaction and to pleasing yourself. Or you wind up becoming so addicted to the pleasure itself that it becomes a compulsion. And so what what I mean by saying that your core identity is not as a sexual being is that sex is a very strong drive. It's a very strong desire that is at work in most people. And it's something to be stewarded. It's something to be nurtured. It's something to be saved for your spouse at the right time. It's something to be celebrated because this is the highest level of intimacy that you can experience as a human being. And it's something that's meant to transcend every other experience you'll ever have. To see that, to see the pursuit of pleasure, to see the pursuit of your own self-actualization as who you are is a complete inversion of the created order. That says that, everything around me is ultimate. Everything I feel is ultimate. I can make or break myself by what I do, and that's not who we are.
Just a very practical question here for youth workers and parents, or even people who are trying to, get their hands around this whole idea that our core identity is not to be as a sexual being. What are some resources? Is there one particular resource? I'm putting you on the spot here, but one particular resource, something that people could read that would really help them understand this issue from a biblical perspective?
There are two resources that I would guide people to, and here I'm talking specifically about women or young women. One is a book called Sex and the Single Girl, written by Ellen Dykes on our staff. It's actually a mini book. I think it's only about 24 pages long, but it really unpacks the meaning of sex and the role of sex in a young woman's life. The other resource that I would point people to is called it's called Sexual Sanity for Women. The seminar is called Finding Sexual Sanity, but the book is called Sexual Sanity for Women. And that's really a resource that can be worked through either individually or within the context of a discipleship relationship to help women who have kind of lost control of sexual desire to begin to bring it back under the dominion of Christ.
Good. Thank you. Well, listen, we need to take a break here, and we're going to come back and we'll work through a couple more of your wonderful, powerful, Christ-centered messages to your daughter about sex and sexuality. And we're talking to Tim Geiger from Harvest USA. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Here at CPYU, we want to help you help parents stay up to date on today's youth culture. One of our most popular resources is our monthly parent page. This 4-page full-color resource offers parents a timely, practical look into current youth culture trends, along with resources to help them parent their children and teens Christianly in today's rapidly changing youth culture. If you're a youth worker who would like to get this monthly resource into the hands of your parents, you can see a sample parent page and learn more by visiting cpyuparentpage.com. Welcome back, everybody, to Youth Culture Matters. We're having a conversation with Tim Geiger from Harvest USA about a blog post he put up, which, by the way, we will link to this and everything else that's been mentioned here in terms of resources. If you go to cpyu.org, go to the podcast page there, and what you'll see under the player for this particular episode of Youth Culture Matters are links to all the resources that we've mentioned. So if you're listening by another streaming service or whatever, come back to our homepage, cpyu.org, and that's the way to access all these things. But this letter he's written to his daughter about on being a woman, a father's words to his daughter, is really powerful. And there are some parts of this letter, Tim, that I want to talk about in light of all the chatter right now and concern, and I think good concern about the abuse culture that we live in, a lot related to the Me Too movement and horrible behaviors on the part of men in particular that are being called out right now. You addressed some of that, and we were talking during the break. I had watched a film documentary film that came out a few months ago called Liberated. And it's a film that was made as a documentary about the college spring break student culture in Panama City Beach, Florida. I believe it was filmed in 2012 or 2013, so but released earlier this year, and it is really disheartening. The expectations that students have when they go to spring break as a result of listening to and believing and trying to follow the cultural narrative. And what really struck me as a man was the brash attitude of the guys and how bold they were in stating it in what can't be described as anything but abusive behavior and attitudes, and horribly skewed and, from a biblical perspective, sinful and immoral views of females. And you address this in this letter to your daughter. There's 3 things you say, and I'd love for you to unpack that in this segment. First, you say you are to be treated with respect and dignity. You say, do not accept being sexualized as a woman. And then you say you should never tolerate sexual harassment.
Sure.
Talk about what you're communicating to your daughter there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. The first heading you mentioned, you're to be treated with respect and dignity, really goes back to my daughter's and every human being's role as an image bearer of God. And we don't have the right to look at another person and to say, you are worth less than I am, and therefore I'm going to use you for my own pleasure or to accomplish whatever I want. We all have inherent dignity because we bear the image of our Creator. And so it is radically sinful and inappropriate for any human being to objectify another, whether it's through treating them with a lack of respect, whether it's through objectifying them by seeing them as a potential sexual partner, whether it's through looking at pornography and objectifying either men or women through that vehicle. It is a crime against God and against our brothers and sisters if we deface them and devalue them by trying to strip away some of the glory that they bear as image bearers. We do that in all kinds of ways. It is possible to do that by sexualizing someone. It's also possible to do that within a same-sex peer group simply by being competitive and saying, well, this person isn't the same as we are. This some of the things that happen in middle school culture among girls and among boys is people in that peer group will kind of identify characteristics that make someone else different, and they'll exploit those differences and say, you're not as smart as we are. You're not as physically talented as we are. You're not as beautiful as we are. You're not as thin as we are. And Walt, that leads so many young women and young men to really struggle with their body image, to struggle with their sense of self-worth, to struggle with their, even with their self-image as someone who is able to be a competent member of the body. They just feel so ostracized, so other. And so we as parents really need to discourage that kind of behavior and help our children to really turn away from that tendency to ostracize and pick on others. As a young woman, one of the things that I really fear for my daughter is that she is going to be sexualized by boys and by young men. And not only do I fear that that's going to happen, because that's something over which I don't have any control, but one of my fears is that my daughter is going to see that this is, sex is one way to feel accepted by someone else. Sex is one way to feel valued by someone else. Sex was never meant to play that role in a human being. Sex was always meant to be, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 7, laying down your life, laying down your expectations in order to serve someone else. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 3 through 5, that the husband's body doesn't belong to himself, it belongs to his wife. And the wife's body doesn't belong to herself, it belongs to her husband. And what he's saying there is, even within the intimacy of a sexual relationship between husband and wife, we're not supposed to pursue primarily our own pleasure. We're supposed to be serving the other by helping them to find pleasure, by helping them to realize it's okay to be naked and unashamed in this holy context. And one of the great lies that we struggle with as fallen creatures is that sex isn't something that is meant to be used in a very limited sense for a very specific purpose, but it's something that's meant for pleasure in general. It's meant to feel connected to someone else. It's meant to get a rush. It's meant to feel comfort when I want to be comforted. It's meant to feel in control whenever I feel out of control. And so to the extent that we can help our daughters fight back against the cultural tide to be objects of sexualization by others and to sexualize themselves, I think that we're helping to restore not only sex to its proper place and role that the Lord created it for, but I think we're encouraging our daughters to really hold on to the Lord and to realize the dignity they have as image bearers. One of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control, right? And self-control means, at a minimum, that we don't act on every impulse, on every desire that we experience, because we realize that we're stewards. We're not sitting on the throne. We're stewards of these desires the Lord has given to us, and we're called to manage them and to control them and to use them rightly. God doesn't say never have sex. He says only have sex in this particular context. And so to the extent that we can help our daughters and sons learn self-control, I think that that's to God's glory.
Yeah, this is good. This is good. I love this. And I want to follow up on that. And just another point you made to your daughter is this, keep sex sacred and within God's design for marriage. At Harvest USA, how are you suggesting to parents and to youth workers that be done? What's your suggestion there on that? I know you're doing what's the seminar? Raising Sexually Healthy Kids, is that the title of the?
It's Raising Sexually Faithful Kids.
Sexually Faithful Kids. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually a better title, so thank you for correcting me there.
That's why we changed it. It used to be Healthy Kids.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, but we repented.
Yeah.
We have a seminar called Raising Sexually Faithful Kids. We have a webinar, which is the same content, just done online over the course of 4 weeks. We ran one of those back in the spring and had actually our biggest attendance ever. We had 500 people joining us from around the country, and we'll be doing that a few times a year moving forward. But what we encourage parents and youth leaders to do is really two things. The first is discipleship, because again, you need to both help your child develop that biblical worldview that says, I am an image bearer. I am a creature. God is sovereign. He is the creator. And everything that I have has been given to me in trust by him. How do I obey him? By using these things wisely and well. But we also need to talk with our kids about what they're thinking and feeling. And the resource that I mentioned to you a moment ago, which I'll be happy to share with you and you can share with your listeners, it's called Helping Your Child Establish Sexual Accountability. It's about developing this ongoing conversation with your child from the very earliest stages of life, where you help them process within the context of your relationship with them what it means to be a boy or a girl, what it means to grow up and have peers who are telling you things that are wrong, what it means to be exposed to images and ideas in the media which are contrary to God's will, what it means to experience sexual desire yourself. You want to develop a relationship with your child where they feel that you're a safe person to process these things with, because they need the benefit of your wisdom. That they need you to lovingly speak truth to them, so that they aren't carried off by, like Paul says in Ephesians 4, by every wind of doctrine, by every good sounding argument. But the other part of the ministry that we encourage parents and youth leaders to engage in with their kids is accountability. Because proactively you're talking about what a godly worldview looks like and how to act, and what you're thinking proactively. But then you always need to ask your child, what are you thinking about? What are you doing? Are you struggling with temptation? Are you giving in to temptation? Have you been looking at pornography? Have you been masturbating? Have you been engaging in borderline behaviors with friends? Have you been doing things that would put you in a dangerous position moving forward? And I can't stress strongly enough that accountability is so important, because we do need to train up our children right. But we need to realize that they are sinners, and that they will sin. And part of accountability is coming alongside your child and hearing their confession, and then going with them to the throne of grace to receive grace and mercy to help in their time of need. That's one of the most powerful witnesses that a parent can have to their child, to help them understand how God's grace works in real time.
So they're sinners just like us, and we have to understand that, which then leads to this question, very practical question: how much vulnerability should we have with our kids as parents, as youth workers, when we're talking about sexual struggle, all these issues we've discussed here? I mean, how much vulnerability is appropriate? Have you talked about guidelines for that at all? Just about ourselves. Yeah,
and that article that I mentioned includes a chapter on that issue. The reality is that this is a wisdom issue. If you have a child whom you are working with proactively, I think it's appropriate to share general information about your own struggle. To say, what you're experiencing right now is something that's completely normal. I went through this when I was your age. I was tempted to look at pornography. I was tempted to sexualize other people. I was tempted to act out sexually, and it might even be appropriate to share, again, in a general sense, this is what I did. But I would encourage parents never to go into exhaustive detail, because that is breaking through, I think, a boundary that is unwise. I think that if your child confesses, or if you suspect that your child is not confessing sin, or if they confess specific sin, I think then, again, this is a wisdom issue, but then they need to know that they are not beyond hope. And so to say, I am a fellow sinner, and I did the same thing, and here's how I felt. Don't focus on the behavior, but focus on how you felt, and then focus on how the Lord worked to restore you. And then say, let's go to the Lord and find how good forgiveness feels.
This is really good, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. I know we could talk a lot more about this, and we've got a time limit. You have to catch a flight, I know that. So we're going to let you go here. But any other resources you want to point us to at this point? I know Chris was feverishly scribbling over there as you were mentioning things. So that will all be included on the website at cpyu.org. But anything else you can point us to that would be really helpful right now?
So we have 2 resources coming out from New Growth Press this summer. One is something that I hope your readers will really be drawn to, Walt, and that is a curriculum called Alive. And Alive is a discipleship curriculum written for students. So a student is anyone really from age 12 on through the end of college. And what it's meant to do is to help to explain a godly worldview of sex and sexuality, and then to talk about different ways in which we fail to live that out. So it talks about things like pornography. It talks about things like the hookup culture. It talks about same-sex attraction. It talks about transgenderism. And it's really meant to be a way for a student and their parent, or a student and a youth worker to really work through these things together. The other resource is called God's Design, and that is a video series meant for small groups and for churches. It talks more at length about God's design for sexuality and how to come alongside people who are struggling in different ways. So both of those will be coming out this summer, and you can find them on our website, harvestusa.org.
Great. Thank you. And as always, we want to encourage folks who are listening to go and check out what's been mentioned here. I do want to recommend you go to the website for Harvest USA, harvestusa.org. There's a lot on there, and the website, the content on there is constantly growing. They're constantly feeding that. We would also suggest that you maybe go back in our podcast archives. We've had Ellen Dykes on and had some great conversations with Ellen. She's been very helpful. And I would say, too, that if you are a youth worker or a parent who wants to address the issue of pornography, directly, check out what's there. I was reminded when you mentioned there, don't target the behavior, but I think about what Nicholas Black has said in his, there's the article he wrote. I think it was called "My Kid's Seen Porn. Now What Do I Do?" Something like that. We'll include a link to that. Focus on the heart, not on the behavior. Stay calm. Very, very good, well-reasoned recommendations that, doggone it, I wish I had had 30 years ago. So, but we appreciate you guys. Tim, thank you. Thanks for taking the time with us.
Praise God.
And folks, again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with you on the next episode of Youth Culture Matters.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.